I never imagined that the man I trusted more than anyone in this world, the one who once held my hand through every hardship, would stand beside my hospital bed moments after I'd been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer and casually hand me a divorce attorney's business card. And standing next to him, her arm intertwined with his, was Rachel Me's best friend since we were teenagers. Not a word of concern, not even a simple "how are you feeling?" Just his cold voice, "You're not earning anymore. I think $1,000 a month should be enough for you to get by. My name is Linda Beckett. I'm 52 years old and live in a quiet town called Maple Hollow, nestled in the Oregon Hills. I'm a children's book illustrator and writer at least, until I gave up everything to build a home, to support my husband's career, and to take care of the people I loved. For years, I cooked, cleaned, supported, sacrificed, and slowly, I became invisible in my own life. The man I married, Greg, was once my creative partner and closest confidant. I thought we were unbreakable. And Rachel had been part of my life since high school. I once let her crash on our couch for weeks when she was out of work. I told her everything, trusted her with everything. And now, there she was, standing beside Greg like she had won some kind of twisted prize. I couldn't decide which betrayal hurt more, Greg asking for a divorce right after my diagnosis, or Rachel smiling without a shred of shame, as if she'd always belonged there in my place. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply said, "All right, let's get divorced." Because in that moment, they believed I had nothing left. No strength, no fight, no future. But what they didn't know was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. From that moment forward, I began planning my return not for petty revenge, but to reclaim everything I had lost, my dignity, my peace, and a life that was truly mine. Looking back, I should have seen it coming, not the betrayal itself, but the slow unraveling that led to it. The way Greg began withdrawing from me wasn't abrupt or dramatic. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like a shift in the air you can't quite explain but feel in your bones. It started when Rachel announced her pregnancy. Now, Greg and I had made a mutual decision years ago not to have children. We both came from large, complicated families and craved the kind of freedom that allowed us to travel, host art retreats, and build our creative lives without interruption. We loved kids, adored our nieces and nephews, but never felt the call to be parents ourselves, and we were at peace with that. Or at least I thought we were. When Rachel broke the news that she and her husband Mark were expecting, Greg's demeanor subtly shifted. At first, I chalked it up to excitement. After all, we'd known Rachel for a decade, sure child would be practically family. But when Greg offered to accompany her to her first prenatal appointment because Mark was swamped at work, I raised an eyebrow. When it happened a second, then a third time, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Rachel has a husband. I reminded him one evening as he ironed his shirt, something he never did for his own meetings, but was suddenly doing for her doctor visits. "She's nervous," he replied without looking up, "and Mark isn't around. What do you expect me to do? She's reaching out." I wanted to scream that I was his wife, not her, that if he had half the concern for me that he was showering on Rachel, he might have noticed I'd been waking up in the middle of the night with unexplained pain in my abdomen and bruises I couldn't account for. But instead, I stood there in silence, watching the man I loved prepare himself to play husband for someone else's wife. And the worst part? Rachel didn't even try to hide it. She'd call him late at night, send him pictures from her appointments, and make casual comments like, "You're the only one who really understands me, Greg." Once, I caught her whispering to him in the kitchen while I was in the next room, her laugh soft and intimate like they were reliving a private joke. Still, I tried to be gracious. I bought her baby clothes, dropped off meals, even knit a blanket with her initials embroidered in the corner. I told myself this was just a temporary blur in our long friendship, that things would settle once the baby arrived, but they didn't. When little Ellie was born, Greg became even more involved. He picked her up from daycare when Rachel needed help, stayed over to assemble furniture, and eventually started attending school functions. And one day, when Ellie was about 6, I overheard a teacher at a holiday event say, "Her dad seems like such a nice man," while motioning toward Greg. That night, I confronted Rachel. She laughed nervously at first, but when I pressed, she admitted that Mark had stopped attending events months ago and that Greg had kind of stepped in. She brushed it off as just a convenience, but when I asked whether Mark even knew, her silence was my answer. The real turning point, though, came during Ellie's elementary school graduation. The night before the event, Greg was rummaging through the closet, throwing suits across the bed like he was preparing for a job interview. "Got a big meeting?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "No," he replied. "I'm going to Ellie's ceremony." "You're what?" I asked, stunned. "Does Mark know you're going?" Greg's jaw tightened. "Rachel asked me. He's out of town. She doesn't want to go alone. And you think it's your place to stand beside her at a milestone like that? You're not her father, Greg. She needs me," he snapped. "And you clearly don't." The words hung in the air like poison. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Desperate for clarity, I called Rachel that same night. "Rachel, does Mark know about the graduation tomorrow?" I asked. She hesitated. "No, but I'll tell him after." "You mean you've kept him out of every school event?" I asked, my voice trembling with disbelief. She sighed. "Don't be so dramatic, Linda. Greg's just more available. It's not a big deal." But it was. It was a very big deal. Because in that moment, it became painfully clear that Rachel had not only stolen my husband, but she had slowly been replacing her own without remorse. And Greg wasn't just going along with it. He was thriving in it. Over the months that followed, their outings increased, from monthly dinners to weekly brunches, and then to late-night emergencies, where Greg would disappear for hours. Mark, once quiet and easygoing, began to grow suspicious too. And one evening, when Rachel and Greg were out helping with a school fundraiser, Mark knocked on my door. "I know this is a bit late," he said, eyes heavy with exhaustion, "but I think we need to talk." He showed me GPS data he had pulled from Rachel's Cara feature he had added after noticing strange mileage patterns. "She's been staying at a hotel 3 times a week," he said quietly, "every time she's out with Greg." I stared at the screen, each data point stabbing deeper into my chest. "What do you want to do?" I asked. He looked up, his expression steely and resolute. "I want to take them down, and I want to do it with you." And that's how it started. The quiet alliance between two broken hearts, bound not by love or vengeance, but by a shared refusal to be made fools of. We agreed not to act rashly. We would be smart, strategic, patient. We began collecting evidence texts, call logs, hotel records. Mark worked from home and started bringing Ellie over to my place when they were out. I kept a journal, noting every lie, every date, every missed school pickup that fell on Greg's shoulders. All the while, I said nothing. I played the part of the tired, sickly wife who didn't ask questions. They thought I was fading away quietly, but what I was really doing was preparing for war. In the months that followed, I carried 2 burdens: the betrayal that had hollowed out my heart and the illness that was quietly draining my strength. At first, I thought I could manage both. I had always been resilient, the kind of woman who took care of others even when no one thought to ask how she was doing. But there's something about being betrayed by the 2 people you trusted most that changes the way your body holds pain. It doesn't just stay in your chest, it seeps into your bones, your breath, your will. The doctors told me I'd need long-term hospitalization, at least 2 years if I responded well to treatment. The words came like a soft, hammer-gentle but irreversible end. When I looked at the scan on the light board, I saw more than just a diagnosis. I saw how everything in my life had collapsed at once. My marriage, my friendships, my health, and how, for the first time, I was truly alone. I called Greg that evening, thinking that maybe, despite everything, he'd show some decency. That maybe he'd offer to help with the logistics, or at the very least, ask me how I was holding up. But when he answered the phone, his voice was flat, like we were discussing a utility bill. "I'll drop by once in a while," he said, before making an excuse about having to run and hanging up before I could say anything more. He never asked what type of cancer it was. He didn't ask about the treatment plan. He didn't even ask which hospital I was going to. At first, I tried to cling to something familiar, something stable. Ellie had always been like a niece to me, bright, kind, and surprisingly perceptive for her age. After I was admitted, she visited me almost every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Mark. She brought me cards she made by hand and drawings of animals with silly names. Her presence, even for a few minutes, softened the loneliness in ways no medication could. But shortly after her 15th birthday, something changed. The visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. When I reached out, she gave vague excuse: school, practice, project sand. Though I understood how chaotic teenage years could be, I couldn't help but feel a shift, like something invisible had pulled her away. Mark didn't have an answer either. "She's been quiet lately," he said one day. "Not just with you, with everyone." Still, I suspected that someone had said something, maybe Greg, maybe Rachel. It wouldn't have been the first time they tried to isolate me under the guise of moving on. Weeks went by with only nurses for company. I watched the seasons change from a narrow hospital window leaves, turning gold, then falling, snow melting into the soil, spring buds blooming without anyone to show them to. My body weakened, but it was my spirit that took the hardest hit. At night, I would lie in bed with headphones on, pretending the soft jazz playing from my old playlist was a conversation I was part of, as if someone somewhere still thought of me, still cared. One afternoon, after nearly a month without a single visitor, Greg showed up without warning. He looked different, flashier somehow, as if he was trying to play a younger man's role in a game he no longer understood. He didn't knock. He just walked in, tossed a manila envelope on my bedside table, and crossed his arms. "Let's make this quick," he said. "This is from my lawyer." Inside was a draft of the divorce, settlement code, clinical and humiliating. He offered me $1,000 a month in alimony. Like that would make up for the years I spent building a life with him, supporting his ambitions, giving up mine, and enduring his silence when I needed him most. I looked at him, this man I had once adored, and saw nothing but a stranger who didn't even have the decency to ask me how I was feeling. Standing beside him was Rachel, of course, wearing the same smug grin she'd perfected over the years, her arms looped through his like she'd always belonged there. They didn't speak, didn't offer comfort or explanation, just stood there waiting for me to sign, as if I were the one who owed them something. And I could have cried, I could have screamed, but instead, I smiled quietly, calmly, because what they didn't know was that I had already spoken to my attorney. I had already started shifting my finances. I had already begun rebuilding my identity, even from this hospital bed. "All right," I said, signing the papers. "Let's get this over with." Greg looked surprised, maybe even disappointed, like he had hoped for a scene. But I gave him nothing, because by then I understood something they never would: true. Strength isn't loud, and dignity doesn't come with revenge. It comes with survival. They thought I was broken, but what they didn't realize was that this was the moment I stopped needing them at all. And from that moment on, every breath I took, every step toward recovery, every dollar I earned, and every page I wrote was part of a quiet storm gathering behind me, because I wasn't just healing. I was preparing. After I signed the divorce papers, something inside me shifted, not in defeat, but in clarity. It wasn't just a legal act. It was the moment I finally untethered myself from two people who had drained me of love, respect, and even the will to speak. And while the hospital walls still confined me, and my body remained fragile from chemo and radiation, my mind, sharp, calm, and resolute, had already stepped outside those walls and begun walking down a different path. The day after the paperwork was finalized, I called Mark, who by then had become not just my co-conspirator, but my closest friend, and the only person who never once treated me like a burden. I told him I was transferring hospitals to be closer to the coast, where the air was cleaner, the nights quieter, and the people fewer. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "We'll be there." Within a week, Mark and Ellie had quietly packed up and moved to a small town not far from the hospital. It was the kind of place where no one knew us, and no one cared about our history exactly what we needed. Mark rented a modest home near the shoreline and made it a habit to visit every afternoon after Ellie finished her classes. Despite the weight she had been carrying since learning the truth about her mother and Greg, she never once turned her back on me. If anything, her loyalty deepened, and her presence was a balm I didn't know I still deserved. With the change in scenery came a shift in energy. My new doctors were more communicative and optimistic, and I finally had time and space to focus on something other than survival. I began writing again, not just for the sake of work, but for the joy of it, for the sheer thrill of creating worlds where children were brave, kind, and clever, and where justice, though sometimes delayed, always arrived. What Greg and Rachel never realized was that during all those years I stayed home to support them cooking, organizing, ghost designing logos for Rachel's failed boutique ventures. I had also been quietly publishing under a pen name. A few short stories here, a couple of illustrated ebooks there. Nothing major, just enough to keep my hands and mind busy. But when my editor heard I had been hospitalized, she reached out, asking if I had more material. It turns out that one of my earlier books, The Blue Fox's Lantern, a story I wrote on a whim years ago, had caught the attention of a small animation studio. The contract came through while I was still on IV fluids. I signed it with trembling hands, not because I was weak, but because I knew this was the start of something Greg could never touch. I now had an agent, royalties, and licensing deal saw, of which I had kept under a trust established long ago, under my maiden name, with layers of legal protection built in. Greg hadn't thought twice when he pushed me to sign the divorce papers quickly. He assumed I was dependent. He never once asked where my money came from or how I'd been paying my insurance or bills during my illness. His ignorance, I realized, was my greatest ally. While Mark and I worked behind the scenes to tie up the loose ends, ensuring all assets were transferred, accounts secured, and evidence preserved, I also made peace with the fact that I would never get an apology from either of them. That realization, oddly enough, felt freeing. Rachel never once reached out. I suppose she assumed that, having won Greg, she had nothing else to worry about. But she didn't know I had already canceled the lease on the condo they were living in, the one that had been under my name from the start, a space Greg had once moved into just temporarily before never leaving. A week later, my phone buzzed with 30 missed calls in the span of 15 minutes. I returned to my room from a short walk down the hall and found the screen flashing like an alarm. When I finally picked up, Greg was shouting. Something about the real estate agent, about how the lease was terminated without notice, and how they were being forced to vacate. "You can't just do this," he barked, as if shocked that his actions might have consequences. "That was never your apartment, Greg," I replied, keeping my voice as even as the tide. "You were just borrowing it. Consider this your notice that the loan has expired." He sputtered, then tried to pivot. "Fine, just transfer the money you promised." The 11-0. "I need it." "I never promised you anything," I said, already putting him on speaker while opening my laptop to finish editing a manuscript. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." "But you said—" I said goodbye, Greg. I hung up. For a while, he continued trying to call, switching between anger and fake concern, between manipulation and guilt tripping, but I stopped picking up. He soon started ignoring calls from my lawyer too, thinking perhaps that if he played stubborn long enough, he could force my hand. But what he didn't know was that every time he did that, I had someone documenting it. Every refusal, every text, every childish attempt at leverage was another log added to the quiet fire I was building. By the time summer rolled around, the hospital allowed me a temporary discharge for recovery at home. Mark came to pick me up with Ellie in tow, both of them carrying fresh groceries and a new scarf Ellie had knitted herself. I looked around my new apartment, small, sunlit, and my Nan felt for the first time in years that I had come home. I wasn't finished yet, but I was no longer surviving. I was living. And as for Greg and Rachel, they still had no idea what was coming next. It didn't take long after the eviction for Greg to start unraveling, though he tried, how he tried to maintain the illusion of control. He called, pleaded, shouted, then pretended nothing had happened. When all else failed, he sent Rachel to leave passive-aggressive voicemails about how unfair it was that I cut them off without warning, as if I had stripped away something they'd actually earned. But I didn't respond. Not to them, and not to the pitying glances from mutual acquaintances who now realized they'd picked the wrong side. The truth was beginning to spread in whispers about the affair, the lies, and the quiet strength I had shown while they played house in a condo I had paid for. And soon, Greg and Rachel were no longer the golden couple of our social circle, but two people scurrying in the shadow of their own choices. Still, they hadn't felt the full weight of what they'd done. Not yet. That moment came when I visited Greg's Parenza visit. I hadn't planned, but felt compelled to make. His mother, Elaine, had always treated me like a daughter, and his father, Walter, though reserved, had respected the way I kept the family grounded during hard times. I didn't want them to hear from someone else, especially not Greg. So when I stepped into their modest home in Ashridge one crisp autumn afternoon, I expected an awkward conversation. What I didn't expect was to find Greg and Rachel already there, seated stiffly on the couch, their expressions tight and their postures defensive. Apparently, Greg had thought he could present their version of the story first to frame the divorce as mutual, the relationship with Rachel as a natural transition, and me as the emotionally unstable ex-wife clinging to old grudges. But whatever narrative they had rehearsed fell apart the moment I stepped through the door. Walter stood up, his brows knitting together with a quiet authority that instantly silenced the room. "We heard enough," he said, glancing at Greg with something between disappointment and disbelief. "Now we'd like to hear the truth." Greg looked like a boy caught lying to the principal. Rachel shifted beside him, her smile brittle and thin. I handed Walter a simple envelope. Inside were copies of documents, dates, messages, financial transfers, and the official ownership records of the apartment. I didn't say a word. I let the paper speak first. Rachel tried to interrupt, her voice trembling. "This is all being blown out of proportion. We didn't mean for it to happen like this." Elaine, who had been sitting quietly until now, finally looked at her and said, with more hurt than anger, "You were like family, Rachel, and you destroyed that with a smile on your face." Greg, unable to maintain his composure, lashed out, blaming me for dragging this out, for turning Ellie against him, for making everything public. But when he pulled out a hotel bill and tried to hand it to his parents like it proved something, perhaps sympathy, perhaps justification, it only made things worse. "We had to stay somewhere after she kicked us out," he snapped. Walter didn't flinch. "You stayed in a luxury suite for a month on borrowed money," he said flatly. "And now you want sympathy?" Rachel turned to Elaine, desperately trying to steer the conversation. "But we're having a baby," she said. "Don't you want to be happy about your future grandchild?" Elaine's eyes narrowed, the warmth long gone. "Greg already had a family. You helped him throw it away." And then, from the corner of the room, came the quietest but most devastating voice of all. "I'm not your daughter," Ellie said, without even looking up from her phone. "I never was." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg blinked, stunned. "Ellie, honey." "No," she said, rising slowly, her voice steady and clear. "You missed every school event, every recital, every birthday. And I never asked for much, but now I know why. You were with her." "And Mom," she glanced at me, her eyes finally meeting mine. She was the one who showed up every time. Rachel tried to speak, but Ellie cut her off. "I know who I want to stay with, and it's not you." At that moment, the last illusion Greg and Rachel had clung to shattered, and what made it even more poetic was that they had no one to blame but themselves. I left that day with Ellie by my side, my in-laws' blessing, and not a trace of doubt in my heart. They had chosen to lie, manipulate, and destroy, and now they would live with the consequences. But the final blow came weeks later, not from me but from the very systems Greg and Rachel thought they could exploit. Greg, who still worked under his father's company, had been using work hours to disappear on sales trips that were, in reality, trysts with Rachel. When Walter finally confronted him, the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. He fired Greg on the spot and, in a move that surprised even me, sent him to work on a friend's commercial fishing boat on the Pacific coast, a brutal job for someone who hated manual labor and sea air. I was told he lasted less than 3 weeks before quitting and disappearing from town altogether. Rachel, without custody, support, or Greg's former income, floundered. She moved into a dingy apartment in a rough part of Portland, taking on a series of dead-end part-time jobs she wasn't qualified for, trying to stay afloat in a life she thought would be lined with luxury. And when the courts ruled that she owed Mark back child support for the year she effectively abandoned her daughter, the spiral only deepened. I didn't celebrate their downfall. I didn't gloat or post anything online. I simply carried on writing, healing, living, and every time I looked at Ellie, or walked along the coastal path near my new home, or signed a new publishing contract, I was reminded that the best revenge is not vengeance at all. It's peace. And peace, once you earn it, is something no one can take away from you. Months passed after everything came undone, not just for them, but for me as well, though in my case, it was the kind of undoing that allows something better to rise from the wreckage. My body, once worn thin by illness and stress, began to slowly regain its strength. I wasn't cured, not completely, but I was healing in more ways than one, and the weight I carried no longer felt like a sentence, it felt like a lesson, one I'd been brave enough to survive. I still lived near the coast in that small, unassuming apartment filled with warm light and ocean air. The walls were lined with sketches and manuscripts, drafts of children's books I once only dreamed of finishing. Now, some of those pages had not only turned into bestsellers, but were being translated into other languages, adapted for animation, and used in classrooms across the country. My name, once hidden behind a pen name, was now on book covers, in articles, even mentioned in interviews with young illustrators who said my stories had helped them through dark times. But none of those achievements meant more to me than the way Ellie would sit beside me in the evenings, curled up with a book I'd written, her laughter soft, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. She never called me Mom, and I never asked her Tobut in every gesture. In every moment of shared silence, she gave me something far greater than a title. She gave me belonging. Mark, ever steady and kind, remained close. He visited often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. One evening, after Ellie had gone to bed, he stayed a little longer than usual. We sipped tea under the porch light, watching the waves roll under the full moon, and he said, almost shyly, "When you're ready, I'd like to grow old with you." It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the tide, but it carried more meaning than any vow I'd ever heard. I didn't answer him right away. I simply reached for his hand, and in that quiet gesture, we both understood that the answer would come when it was time. I had spent so long putting others first, silencing my needs, minimizing my value, that I had to learn to choose again, but this time, I would choose from strength, not fear. My doctors eventually told me that if I continued responding well to treatment, I might be discharged permanently within the year. That small bit of hope felt bigger than any revenge. I wasn't just getting back at those who hurt me. I was building a future beyond their reach, a life rooted not in bitterness, but in clarity, resilience, and purpose. As for Greg and Rachel, their names rarely pass my lips anymore. Not out of avoidance, but because they had simply stopped mattering. Greg, I heard, had moved 3 states away after failing to hold down steady work. Rachel, from what little news trickled through mutual contacts, was living alone, her social circle reduced to the few who hadn't yet grown tired of her stories. She had burned every bridge she thought would never collapse, but I had no desire to look back. My energy was now focused on the life I was creating, a life shaped by intention and truth, not survival. And as I walked forward, step by careful step, I held on to one truth that anchored me more than any victory ever could. Justice doesn't always come as a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives softly, in the form of peace, of love returned, and of waking up one day to realize you are no longer afraid. Because revenge might feel good for a moment, but reclaiming your worth quietly, fully, and on your own terms, that lasts forever. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been betrayed, broken, or underestimated, know this: you are not alone, and your comeback can be the most powerful story you'll ever tell. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of strength, justice, and healing. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else.